looks like. So I sought biblical counsel. I talked to a friend of mine who's a seasons ahead of me in life. And I said, hey, when your oldest son first went off to college, what did you do well? And what do you regret? And I remember him telling me, he said, when he went off, I not only lost my oldest son, but I kind of lost my best friend. I regret not building godly male friendships. He says, I feel a little lonely. I said, note to self. So that was 5 years ago. I started a men's group with some godly men. I said, hey, I want to get some godly men together. And we've been meeting together Monday ever since to build those friendships, those male friendships. It's really important to do that. So you'll constantly have these times in life where it's just a new season of life. I don't know what your season is, but there's times where you're naive and you have to grow. But Jan, you don't want to be a fool and think that God's word has nothing to say. So let's dig into this virtue here with the book of Proverbs. I love this. So let's go ahead and go through the book. This is the very beginning of Proverbs. Remember, Solomon prayed, God said, hey, I'll give you anything you want. And he asked for wisdom. And God said, because you asked for wisdom, I'll give you riches as well. So let's go ahead and read these verses. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You see this link in the faith. Men, I think God is telling us something. When I have highlighted here 17 different properties or sub-virtues linked to prudence. It's mentioned 17 times in this kind of modern business lingo. We would call this a prudent man is that goal or desired outcome of the book of Proverbs. In these 7 verses read like purpose statements almost, don't they? So if we dive into the biblical decision-making process, we're going to find out how we're to make prudent decisions. But before we do that, we have to know what's our tendency, right? What's our default? There's really 2 of them. So let's go ahead and talk about that for a moment. So I want you to reflect, right? When you're faced with a decision, say to yourself, I tend toward, not always, right? But it's a bent or inclination, too much analysis before a decision or too little analysis before making a decision. Yeah, I know myself, my tendency, I have a type A personality, is too little analysis before making a decision. So I've had to train myself to go, pull back, Pete, get some wise counsel, try to look at more context. Remember, this is where memory comes in, looking back on how God used this similar situation, where he was, how it worked, and just kind of start noodling through these things. Many of you tend towards underanalyze just like me, and many of you tend toward overanalyze. Now, some of it's based upon personality, that you can do about that. Some of it is, you might be an underanalyze because you don't have a proper amount of fear or caution. You're impatient. So you move ahead and then you kind of pray backwards. Have you ever done that? Maybe that's just me, right? You move ahead on a decision. You go, oh God, can you baptize the steps I just took? Or maybe you're an overanalyzer because you grew up, you're afraid of making a mistake. There's so much fear of making a wrong decision or disappointing someone. I'm a recovering people pleaser. I know how that goes. Those types of things, right? You have a tendency, and you have to learn to retrain yourself. Well, you have to retrain yourself because you have to get into this window of wisdom, I call it, right? You have to move a certain direction. So a prudent man takes knowledge. You don't just make a decision just on quick knowledge. You process it, right? That's where you start gaining understanding. Then you make a decision. You choose to act on the decision. It's one thing to make it, but if you don't act on it, then you really didn't make a decision. Some of us are those bosses who don't make decisions, and a lot of us who've worked for bosses who don't make decisions. I'm in the government, so I work with a lot of people who can't make a decision. So we need to be doers, but we have to think before we act. So whether your tendency is to make a rash decision or to be a paralysis by analysis kind of thing, that kind of overanalyze, you have to move in this spectrum of a prudent decision, this kind of window of wisdom. Now, look, man, We know that every complex decision, whether it's personal, on a job, in our family, will necessarily, get this, necessarily have unknown variables. You will not get perfect information. This tension between having very little information and too much information can only be overcome by the virtues of both faith and prudence. You see this link here. God knows, God has it. You have to plug in to with your mind to his mind to kind of, that's that renewing process. So I use this example of, I have this visual in the book. I talk about this typical mystical approach do we take to decision making. And this is that Christians with the false reason dichotomy. I started here, by the way. I'll just, confession here, right? So use the decision, should I go to blank college, or whatever your decision is right now, you're thinking about, should I take this job, or should my kid go to blank college, right? Do you have an idol of your alma mater? That's the most important thing in the world, not realizing they're going to make your kid into a little Marxist. So you got to be careful. So this mystical approach is we kind of think that God just decides independent of us, and we're waiting for him to send us this impression or feeling. And then we wait and pray without knowledge, or we do what I did, right? You run full speed ahead and you kind of baptize your steps you already took. We decide that God told me to go to blank because I prayed about the decision. So we're just praying about this end decision, forgetting about the God of the visions, the God of how to get there. And is that God's vision, or is that my vision? Well, that is going to inevitably lead to a careless decision. I remember this when I was in seminary. Dr. Geisler had asked the class, there's over 50 people in the class, said, how many of you as Christian ethics have read through the entire Bible? He said, now I'm including Numbers and Leviticus. Me and two other men in the class of over 50 men raised our hands. Now, let me ask you a question. If he would have said, how many of you were called in the ministry? How many hands would have went up? All 53, don't you think? Well, how do you know and distinguish between God's call, God's voice, and your own voice if you haven't even been in his word where his voice is? You don't even know how he thinks, right? It's impossible. But we take this very Western approach, right? We take that initial calling that Dave Ramos unpacked for us, right? We're all called into ministry. That's why God gave us gifts. If you're sitting in church, you should be feeling this holy discontent if you're in the stands and you're not on the field where the church needs you to use your gifts, or needs you, period. And that's where you discover your gifts, right? You should really feel this sense of discontent. We're all called, if you will, in the ministry. Right? The Holy Spirit indwells all of us when we accept Christ. Well, then there's this prudent approach, right? This is really critical. And I want you to remember this. Look, men, don't just pray for the decision, this binary yes, no. Pray for the steps along the way. Because when God gives you a no, all you're going to hear is no, and you aren't going to learn anything about yourself. And guess what God's going to do to you? I promise, he's done it to me. He's going to give you the exact same type of scenario so that you learn the lesson he wants you to learn. So if this, should I go to blank college, or whatever that decision is? Well, we decide dependent on God's word, his principles that he revealed to us, wise counsel, men who know us and will speak truth in our lives. That means that we're surrounding ourselves with really good friends who will challenge us, and not ear ticklers, right? To tell us what our itching ears want to hear, but will tell us what we need to hear, right? Proverbs tells us wounds from a friend can be trusted, but as an enemy that multiplies kisses. We pray with wisdom. Look at this feedback loop, right? And we're walking each step of the way. We're praying and leaning on God, and we're remembering how he answered before. And then we implement these steps prudently and prayerfully. This will lead to a prudent decision. Hey, if you don't know what your tendency is on decision making, ask someone who relies on. I bet you your wife knows. That's just a guess here, or maybe some of your employees. Where do I have my tendency when it comes to decision making? Well, I love this this diagram here. I find it useful, and I like it because it uses the visual uses steps. And this is a pretty typical, business model on making decisions. So I have a link below where I downloaded this, but I like it because it reminds me to pray for each step. Well, first of all, I know this is a big one. Actually, what problem are you trying to solve? We've all been in meetings where, whether it's technical or not, where people are talking and it's like 30 minutes in, you say to yourself, I'm so sorry, I've been here for 30 minutes. What problem are we trying to solve? And all of a sudden you see people scratch their head and you get a couple different answers. And then you get back to what problem you're actually trying to solve, because people will bring in all kinds of things. If you're a leader, your job is to have that clarity of the problem you're trying to solve. You're a leader in your home. your spiritual godly, according to God, your spiritual leader of your home. You have to really figure out what's that decision your family's trying to make. And listen, friends, your wife's counsel is very valuable. So you better make sure that you take that into account. So that first step is identifying it. But you have to know what your tendency is, right? The paralysis by analysis guy will get stuck on step 2. And if you were like me, right, this under analysis, you're gonna go on step 1 and you're just gonna go ahead and just jump forward, right? You're gonna say, woohoo, I'm gonna go take action. I got something to do. And then you're gonna backwards pray down the steps, right? Of God. Can you kind of baptize those steps? You get in trouble. Well, Proverbs 19, 2 and 3 gives us a little warning about doing something like that. I used to actually end all my counseling sessions with this verse. It says, it's not good for a person to be without knowledge, and he who hurries in his footsteps errs. Oh, God gave me a type A personality. He's telling me that that's can get me into trouble in my fallen nature. And he's right. It has gotten me into trouble. The foolishness of a man ruins his way, and his heart rages against the Lord. Or I love how the NIV 1984 says it, man, a man's own foolishness ruins his life, yet his heart rages against the Lord. So I tell people why I ended the counseling sessions that I say, hey, look, you came here for biblical counsel. I gave it to you. You can do whatever you want. You go your way or God's way, but don't blame God for the result. Your own foolishness will ruin your way, but don't blame God. Whoa, God, woe is me. Us men, we can get PMS too, right? Poor me syndrome, right? Why? Woe is me, Lord. And we forget that we just ran ahead and we ignored his advice along the way. God has something more for us. Well, again, this is the paralysis by analysis guy, right? They'll kind of get stuck here. If you're a too much analysis type, you're looking for perfect information. Well, just like the too little analysis person, who uses faith backwards, right, to kind of pray down the steps after already independently made a decision. The person here, where's faith? Where's faith at? You're going to get all perfect information? I don't think so. You're going to have gaps, but you need to make a decision. And men, we know that all decisions are time bound. If the time to make the decision passes by, you just made a decision to do nothing. And nothing's worse than a passive man. That's what got us in trouble where we're at right now in the garden. The first passive man was Adam. Where was he, right? When his wife was out chit-chatting and the enemy snuck in there. Well, we have to gather information, right? And then you start moving along the way. And each one of these steps, has remember, there's prudent steps you take along the way here. So if you look at this here, the gathering of knowledge, right? Well, what you have to do is you don't just need knowledge, but you need the proper discernment. What's true, what's false. If you're a leader at a higher level, you'll have all these. If you're a leader of leaders, as you know, being a leader of a team is one thing, but being a leader of leaders who lead teams is another level. But if you're a leader of leaders who are leaders of leaders who lead teams, man, there's a what they call a VUCA cloud there. Dr. Tatum taught me about the VUCA cloud, right? The higher you're up in the leadership chain, the more volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity there are. So you have to kind of break through the VUCA cloud, walk the floor, and get information. You don't want to make the wrong decisions with just a few data points. You have to make sure you're surrounded by trustworthy folks. You're gathering knowledge. You're discerning between good counsel and evil counsel, truth and error at that step. Again, the depth of the decision, the more impact it has, the more knowledge you gather. Then understanding, you're kind of looking at alternatives. Well, hey, here's a pros, cons. I'm actually going to a meeting when I leave here. We're going to kind of start identifying alternatives to something we have to do. We've invited more people in. Me and just one other gentleman, we're chasing down this big decision we have to make. So let's invite some other folks with different backgrounds, and we're going to unpack those things today. And this is where you start really reasoning. Then you start weighing the evidence. Again, that back to the discernment. Godly counsel, you almost go up and down the steps sometimes, depending on how complex the decision is. You're trying to figure out, okay, these alternatives, are these the right alternatives? Are these alternatives based on the right information, which is true or false? Then you choose, right? And when you make a choice, you kind of use memory and caution, kind of look back on how God worked in that before. God's always worked with me in seasons of life. I've done different things in my life. engineer, work for big companies and small companies. I went in ministry full time, went to ministry part time. I'm more of a Paul than a Peter, if you will. I work for government now. I don't know what God's next season is for me. I feel like he's doing something, that something's going on. Well, what am I doing as I'm processing? I'm trying to remember, okay, look back on how God dealt with me in these decisions before. So it's like your own personal book of Acts. It's a good thing to have. I have little notes on big things that God did in my life. Well, what's the book of Acts? It's just highlights of the church, right? You don't have to journal every little detail, nook and cranny of your life. If you do, that's good on you. But those highlights, right? Because we forget, especially we're in the middle of a decision, in the cloud of it all. We forget, hey, God's been here before. Well, what did he teach me last time? How did he lead the decision? Do I need to seek different counsel? You just kind of start doing those things together. And then you got to take action. My friend, you got to take action. If you know if something's time bound, you have that bullet and then you work backwards. You got to make a decision. But bad leaders take all the weight on themselves. Bring in other people to kind of give you some more data. Then it's good to kind of review it. Once you made a decision, you kind of look backwards. Hey, how was it? What did it look? Kind of reflecting back. I admit that's a step that I'm not good at. I've gotten better at thanking God for the decision, whether it's a yes, a no, or not yet. Right? Thanking Him for giving me an answer. But just trying to get better to reflect back, especially while it's fresh, and taking down a few notes is an important thing to do, I think. Now, there's some times where you got to go with the gut. There's a gut decision. I'll give you an example of this. My wife and I were looking at moving. I know from Acts 17:26, I give that to everybody. I call it God's moving verse. It says, from one man, God created every nation of men, determined a time set for them in the exact places they should live. God did this so that man will reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. Well, Cheryl and I are newly married. We have 2 kids, and my wife always kind of wanted to live in the country. And we were, driving 30 miles up to McLean Bible. I was really involved in ministry there. And we started looking for houses. This is year 2000. Started kind of looking around for houses and find a nice little country place, and that she likes, further away, and it didn't have a basement. and I found ourselves, especially like my wife was really getting into it. I found myself we're talking ourselves into this place and making it work. And man, I just couldn't shake the gut feeling that we're not supposed to move. Now, listen, maybe you guys can amen this. I really wish God would have told Cheryl that, but he didn't. He told me that. I had no other information, nothing, but just something wasn't right. So I said, honey, we were down the road, my friends. I said, something just isn't right. And it's like, oh, you see the disappointment, right? I had to make a decision. I know I'm like, honey, it's just not right. But she trusted my decision. Wouldn't you know it? A year later, 2001 hits, boom, man, the housing market's going crazy. So we ended up making money in our houses. They're breaking even. And we moved into a single family home with a basement. We had it unfinished. Cheryl's mom had a stroke, and we had her basement finished so that we can take care of her. Friends, we'd have never been able to do that if we would have moved in that house. And I thank God for that moment. Going with the gut, God was just impressing that on me, that something wasn't right. So I hope you find this helpful. And I don't know what decision you have on the handout that was sent out. There's some questions, but really think about it. Do you have an important decision you need to make, now or in the future? I heard some of you guys talk about new jobs and things, a change in career, life transition, relationships. Should you get married, not get married?